So let's start at the beginning. Mr. Brook, where are you from?
I grew up in Israel, in the city of Haifa, which is off the Mediterranean. My parents escaped Europe, fortunately, before the Holocaust, and they came to then Palestine. My father came from Austria, from Vienna, and my mother from Poland, a small town near Warsaw, and they met in Palestine and Israel in the 1930s.
And what did your parents do
my
for a
father,
living?
main career, he was a football, soccer player, and he played in Austria for Akoa Vienna, which was a Jewish soccer team in Austria, and he worked in Israel as a welder, and also played in Israel soccer. That was really his love, playing football. My mother was a seamstress. She was working at home, knitting and sewing.
Did Israel have by then a mandatory army?
Once Israel was created in 1948, the Israeli military was created, and everybody, every man and woman was supposed to serve in the military when they became 18 years old. So when I turned 18, I also served in the Israeli military as a regular soldier. And after I finished medical school in 1968, I served in the Israeli army as a physician. I took an officer course. I fought in 2 wars. The first one was in the 6-Day War, and I was a medic. I was not yet a physician, and I served as a medic in the Battle of Jerusalem, and then in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I served as a battalion physician for a supply battalion in Sinai, facing the Egyptian.
How old were you then? And did you have a...
I was born in 1941, and so in the 6-Day War, I was 25 years old, a 26-year-old, and I was already married, and I had 2 more weeks left for medical school. It was very difficult to be in a war, in the 6-Day War, because the Battle of Jerusalem was Jerusalem. So, but after the Jordanians started to bomb the city, Israel did fight back, and they captured the old city of Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. It was a very ferocious battle, and for me it was very difficult to take care of so many wounded, seriously wounded soldiers and paratroopers. I also took care of many Jordanian soldiers that we captured, and they were wounded. And so war is a terrible thing, but sometimes you have no choice but to fight it to survive. It's a much more difficult and different war. Israel was not ready for it. I was in medical school. I was still going to school, and they did not call the medical student because we had 2 more weeks to finish medical school. So we knew that the war was started when our hospital in Jerusalem started to be bombed by the Jordanian, and then we were called to help in taking care of the wounded in the hospital, and then I was going to Port City when the fighting was going on to bring wounded soldiers back to the hospital, starting with civilians and soldiers and Jordanian soldiers.
In 6 Day War, were you stationed in a camp?
Israel military, 90% is reserve. I lived in the city of Jerusalem in student housing with my wife. I was recently married, and the way it works in Israel, if the military's they call the reserve, they call people from home. Israel is a very small country. In the 6 Day War, there were only 3 million Jewish people in Israel. Yet Israel could raise an army of 250,000 because 90% of the people were civilians that were called. Men served in the military until in the reserve until they were 55 years old, usually training a couple of weeks to a month a year. And then if there is a national emergency, they are called, as I was called.
Before the 6 Day War, did you see the UN troops around on horses on the border?
Yeah, we saw the United Nations troops on the border when I was driving by the border of Gaza. I saw the United Nations troops, yes.
Did you ever talk to them? What kind of feeling was this? After the 6 Day War, what's the situation? What's happened?
What happened Israel in the 6 Day War? It was able to conquer in 6 days 3 militaries, the Egyptian, the Syrian, and the Jordanian. And the size of Israel increased now to include the Gaza Strip, the whole Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, including Jerusalem, the old city, and the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria. So Israel became very a very big mistake. The government and the people felt that they are very strong, they cannot be conquered, and they did not take seriously the threats by Egypt and Syria, especially Egypt, that did not accept the results of the 6 Day War and wanted to capture Sinai and the Golan Heights back. So people became very aloof, and they dismissed the danger of the neighbors around Israel.
Were you allowed to go straight back home to finish your degree after the 6-Day War, and
I did not, as I explained to you, I was a civilian. When I finished medical school after the 6-Day War, I went to do my training. I did my internship, and I also did 5 years residency in pediatric. So I became a pediatrician. After the 6-Day War, I did serve in the military every year for 2 weeks to a month, but I was a civilian.
how?
As I explained to you, I was a physician, worked as a physician. I was a battalion physician.
Okay.
I had a battalion under me of supply. We supplied ammunition and gasoline and water and food to a division of tanks, which is about 300 tanks. My battalion had about 700 men and 30 women and about 300 trucks that we brought all those supplies to the troops, to the tank. All reserve. It did not exist except in emergency, that people were called. We trained every year or two, and then when the Yom Kippur broke, we were called to right away, and within a few hours we were able to start moving towards the Suez Canal. It happened on Yom Kippur, 1973. But we practice being called every year. We rehearse being called to duty in an emergency all the time.
Were you scared by then going back to Yom Kippur into a war situation the second time?
The Yom Kippur War was a very difficult war, and we were scared because we were in a very bad situation. We had no information what was really going on, and we had suffered a lot of casualties, and I described it in details in my book, in the sense of Sinai, where I described how afraid people were to be bombed and to be attacked by the Egyptian. We were not a fighting battalion, but we were very susceptible to attacks from aeroplanes, from artillery, from commandos. So yes, people were afraid, and it was difficult to feel And no, we sent them, we took care of them, we sent them to the hospital if they needed to go to the hospital, or if they didn't, we treated them and they were taken away by military police to to detention camps. And those in the hospitals, after they got better, were brought back to a detention camp.
How long did you spend in war?
The war lasted 17 days. It's not very long, but it was a horrific 17 days. I was wounded in the last day myself, and I had to be evacuated. I was going out to take care of soldiers, and I was hit by a Katyusha explosion, and I lost my consciousness, and I injured my leg, and the left side of my face, I had a fracture, and I had shrapnel in my leg. So I didn't go right away. I put a bandage on my wound, and I kept working for about 12 more hours until I couldn't see with my eyes, so they evacuated me.
How long did you spend then in hospital for that?
I was in the hospital for about 10 days. They put the fracture back. They fixed the fracture, but I was in the hospital for about 10 days.
And
I got better. I got better. And fortunately for me, I did not have something that caused me a long-term consequences. So I was lucky to be alive.
And what happened with the state Israel? Did everybody go back to work?
No, Israel invaded Egypt and surrounded the Egyptian army, and there was a ceasefire, and the military stayed in Egypt for about 4 months until they had an agreement of disengagement. They went back to Israel, and as I told you, most of the army were civilians, so they went back to life, whatever they did before, all kind of professions. Like my medics, one was a lawyer, one was a teacher, one was worked in taxes, so they were civilian that went back to life as a civilian.
You have lots of fears, or you talk all the time about it?
Well, the war left a tremendous impact on me, and I wasn't going to be the same person that I was before because of what I experienced. I did not know then that it's a form of PTSD. I know now. In my case, I was fortunate that my PTSD wasn't very serious. I became more careful and hyper-vigilant I talk about it. I wrote a book about it as I show you about the Yom Kippur War. Writing the book helped me a lot to express what I went through. But there are many people who didn't talk, who didn't get the help. When I realized I needed help, that was sometime later. I did go and talk about it to medical professionals who helped me deal with what I experienced. What treatment does, it doesn't make you forget or erase what you experience. It teaches you to accept it and live with it and put it in the right perspective, right proportion.
After Yom Kippur, did you feel sad or angry? Because you said later on you had different feelings.
Well, the most overwhelming feeling was the feeling of sadness and sorrow, because I lost several good friends who died in the war. One of my neighbors died. 3 doctors from my class in medical school died. My high school in Haifa, lost 73 students in the war. I mean, it's a school, it's not a big school. So there were so many dead people, and there were thousands of wounded in body, and probably many more damaged psychologically. So the overwhelming feeling was a feeling of sadness and sorrow and shock, because we were not ready for that kind of experience.
Did you see in Israel a psychologist, or did you go to the US American VA?
In the US, I left for the US 8 months after the war to start my fellowship in UCLA, and then 7 years later I joined the US Navy, and I served in the Navy for 27 years as a physician. And only after I retired from the Navy, and after I wrote the book, I realized that I would probably benefit from treatment. And I went to the Veteran Administration Hospital in Washington and asked to be treated, and they were very helpful. I had about 12 sessions where they helped me very much deal with it. So it's different because in the Israeli army, it's made of everybody. It's a really true cut of the Israeli society. Everybody has to serve when they are 18. The United States Navy is people who volunteer. It's not a conscription. So it's a more selected group of people who choose to serve in the military. As far as a discipline, the United States Navy is much more disciplined. Yeah, I worked as a physician.
Why did you?
Served I spent most of my time in the hospital in Washington, in Bethesda. I was taking care of children, and I dependent of the military, but I also did research. I did research on infectious diseases, on mostly about anaerobic infections, and also I worked on infection after radiation and infection, and I also worked on the biodefenses, like how to defend from biological weapons, such as anthrax. I researched how to protect people from anthrax infection and see what antibiotics works best for them, especially if you have also exposure to radiation, what will work best and how to save them from dying. Experiments on mice, and later on we did it on monkeys, especially. Hopefully we will never have to use it, but it was a very important, I think, contribution to understanding and treating anthrax.
So what would that be? What would help against atomic radiation? Have you heard about the atomic veterans? I had talked to, they did feel not so good after receiving the shots and getting home.
Vaccination for anthrax is not very easy to take. It can cause people to feel unwell, you're right. I took care of children that were hospitalized in Walter Reed and the Navy Hospital, but also took care of some adults as well, and research. And I did go on some missions to several places to study, to do research.
Did you go to places that were bioweaponized?
No, I did not. I went to places to study infections. We studied, for example, infections in the Navy divers who dived into the bay to do some work under the water. So I did some research on Navy divers when I just started the Navy. We did it in Norfolk in United States.
What kind of infections can a Navy diver get?
Ear infections from contaminated water. So we studied what works best for them and how to prevent those infections in divers. Navy divers dive in contaminated water. They a lot of time dive in areas that are not clean. To clean it or to fix things, so they are at particularly high risk. But you're right, whatever we found would help also non-Navy people. Absolutely.
Did you ever get asked to be redeployed abroad?
I was not. I was already older, so I was not called. I served in the military during the war in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, but I did
military?
I'm really not an expert on US military training, but I can tell you that the medical training of medics and physicians is superb, and they are doing a very good job in making the people train in realistic conditions and save people life. I think the advances they made in protection and treatment under difficult conditions are very, very important and good. One important challenge I had as a person was to deal with throat cancer, and I want to explain to your listener that I had throat cancer 15 years ago, and I don't have vocal cords, and that's why my voice is so difficult to understand. And speaking is a challenge for me. And even though I don't have vocal cords, I can speak through a voice prosthesis. And being sick with a potentially deadly disease is difficult, and in many ways it brought me back the memories of fighting for my life when I had cancer. And in many ways, fighting cancer is similar to fighting in a war, because you're fighting for your life. And there is also PTSD when you have a serious illness to deal with. And fortunately, you get help, because like in the war, you do it with friends, and here too, when you're sick, you get people, friends and family to help you. But the most important thing for both surviving war and cancer is that you have greater appreciation for life. And that's what I felt after I was able to survive it, even without vocal cords. To mention it, I decided to write down my experience as a physician who had cancer. I wrote a book about it. It's called My Voice, that talks about how it was to deal with cancer and fight for your life in the same way I did during the war. I was diagnosed 15 years ago, and the cancer came back 2 years later, and 13 years ago they had to remove my vocal cord. So I think that I am healed, but I keep being vigilant and making sure it does not come back. I think it's important to make sure that you keep an eye on every possible recurrence, and so I get checked and tested, and whenever there is something that needs to be, I'm very vigilant about taking care of it. I believe that life is very should be cherished and should be preserved. Not only my life, but also the life of every patient.
You work and research with with a big international team for the US Navy.
Yes, I did meet doctors from many other countries who came to be trained, and it was very rewarding to visit those places. I gave lectures all over the world,
did?
I have to be honest that going to Germany is not easy for me because of the memories of what happened to my family and my people. But I understand that there is a new generation in Germany of people who renounce the Holocaust. But there is still anti-Semitism everywhere, and I'm very conscious of it. And I feel like a proud Jew who fought for his country and for his life, and was fortunate to be born to a state who has an army and military that will never allow the Holocaust to happen again.
In your general medical training and the army training, while your general medical and army training, was there already good research on shell shock or PTSD?
When I took officer course, military office, medical officer course, it was in 1970, and they did not teach us much about PTSD or shell shock. We only got 1 hour of a lecture about the psychological issues. This is why when I had to deal with it during the Yom Kippur War, I was completely unprepared. I had no idea how to take care of the patients. Things changed, and unfortunately, Israel and United States had many conflicts, wars in recent 30 years that made them become very specialized in PTSD. And today there's much better training in both militaries. But realistically, you cannot prevent PTSD. Some people get it because it's terrible, war is terrible, and you cannot predict who would get it and who would not. And the important thing is to recognize it, not be ashamed of it, and get treated, get help. Help is available, and you can turn your world around and your life around and save yourself and your family if you get treated. And you can turn your world around and your life around and save yourself and your family if you get treated.
How are you of Corona now?
I'm very careful. I got vaccinated. I protect myself. I wear a mask. Being a laryngectomy, I put a special filter here to clean the air from any possible viruses. And I know that people like me may be more susceptible, so I'm very careful. And I'm doing okay so far. Fortunately, today we have good vaccines and we have good antivirals and also medications that people can take. Gamma globulin that can help people. So hopefully the world will be able to defeat Corona and learn how to live with it.
There's so many untold stories about.
I'm trying to think about. I have many stories that fill up the book. I think an interesting story is how I took care of a wounded Egyptian pilot that his aeroplane was shut down not far away from us. And I went with my medical team to help him. And when he had a broken leg and he had a burn, and we took care of him. And after that, he showed us a picture of his family, where he had two little children that were the age of my children. And I realized at that moment that he had something that he wanted to go back to. I finally understood the humanity of my enemy, of my adversary. And if I had any reservations about the difficulty to take care of people who tried to kill us, like Egyptian soldiers, it really went away once I learned to know the Egyptian pilot when we captured. So it was a very humanitarian incident that happened to me during the war. Yeah, I read stories about the other wars. It's interesting to see what other people experience. And it's easier for me now, having been in the war myself, to understand a little bit more what they went through. It's difficult to, when you see a movie about the war, it's really not like it is, because the difference is that in the movie, no bullet is going to hit you. When you are in the war, your life is on the line. You can be killed any minute. I realize that most people who get hit, wounded or killed, happen because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And war is terrible, but it's something that unfortunately we will still have to do it. I think the best, but it should be the last option after people try everything else. I think the best way to prevent the war is to be ready for it, and hopefully that will deter the other side. One of the most difficult things in the war was to realize that I was feeling fear. Being afraid was a new sensation for me. And I really didn't want to tell anybody about it. And when soldiers came to me, started to come to tell me that they were afraid, I didn't know how to deal with them. And then I realized